The deafening hum of the primary hydraulic forging press died at exactly 9 o'clock on Monday morning. In its place, a silence so thick you could taste the metallic dust settled over the foundry floor. The massive HMI touchscreen panel, which normally flashed green with high-pressure cycle counts, was now frozen on a stark, blinking red error. License validation timeout. On the catwalk, Brad Coleman, the newly appointed chief operating officer, was screaming into his radio, his face turning the same shade of crimson as the warning lights. He didn't know that 50 miles away, I was sitting on my back porch, sipping black coffee, watching the morning fog roll over the hills. I had warned him, but Brad believed an MBA and a family connection made him smarter than 20 years of industrial automation logic. He was about to find out exactly how much my silence cost. To understand how we got here, you have to understand the foundry. The automated casting and forging line at Coleman Metal Works was not something you could buy off the shelf. It was a massive, roaring beast of heavy machinery, stretching over 300 feet across the plant floor. It took raw billets of carbon steel, heated them to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit in a series of induction coils, and then fed them into a sequence of 3 automated hydraulic forging presses. These presses applied 4,000 tons of force to stamp out heavy-duty steering knuckles and axle shafts for some of the largest heavy equipment manufacturers in North America. If the timing on the conveyor was off by even a tenth of a second, the glowing hot steel would jam, creating a pileup of molten metal that could destroy a $300,000 die set or trigger a catastrophic hydraulic fire. The entire system was orchestrated by a network of Siemens S7-1500 programmable logic controllers, or PLCs. These industrial computers ran custom software that monitored hundreds of inputs every millisecond. Temperature sensors, hydraulic pressures, laser positioning grids, and safety light curtains. I wrote that code back in 2006 when I was 32 and running my own freelance consulting business. Vance Automation Systems LLC, the old founder, Roger Coleman, hired me to automate the plant. At the time, the factory was still running on outdated physical relays and manual lever controls. Roger was a brilliant, practical man who had built the company from a small machine shop in 1982. He understood metal, but he didn't understand software. He wanted his factory to compete with international manufacturers, and he knew automation was the only way. We signed a freelance development contract. Because Roger was tight on cash at the time, we agreed to a lower upfront development fee of $45,000. In exchange, the contract specified that my company retained the intellectual property rights to the custom control block algorithms, particularly the proprietary thermal predictive cooling code I had spent 5 years developing. The agreement granted Coleman Metal Works a non-exclusive license to use the software on the condition that the system maintained active licensing terms. To enforce this, I embedded a security validation routine into the PLC's firm operating block. Every 7 days, the PLC was programmed to ping a secure local server in the plant office. This local server ran a small handshake application that verified the license key. If the handshake failed for 2 consecutive weeks, the program would assume the license had been revoked and safely ramp down the system to a controlled stop, locking the controls until a new validation key was entered. For 2 years, I worked as a contractor, refining the system and keeping the plant running at peak efficiency. The factory's annual revenue climbed from $12 million to $35 million. In 2008, Roger realized he couldn't afford to let me walk away. He offered me a full-time position as lead plant automation engineer. He offered a solid salary of $140,000, excellent benefits, and a promise that my proprietary software license would remain in effect as long as the system was in operation, with my consulting firm receiving a small annual maintenance fee of $5,000 to cover the software licensing renewals. I accepted. I liked Roger, and I loved the challenges of the plant. For the next 18 years, I practically lived in that factory. I knew every wire, every sensor, and every logic gate in the system. I watched the company grow to an $85 million enterprise, employing over 200 workers. I upgraded the hardware 3 times, transitioning from legacy serial networks to high-speed Profinet fiber optic cables. I designed the safety systems to exceed the strict standards of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, installing dual-channel safety PLC modules and safety light curtains that would instantly cut power to the hydraulic actuators if a worker's hand broke the light barrier. But Roger was getting old. By the time 2025 arrived, he was 67 and his health was failing. He decided to step back from daily operations, remaining as the chairman of the board, but handing the reins of chief operating officer over to his nephew, Brad Coleman. Brad was 31 years old and possessed a brand new MBA from an elite university. He had never worked a day on a factory floor, never smelled hot oil, and never seen the raw power of a 4,000-ton press. To him, the factory was not a complex ecosystem of humans and machines. It was just a collection of numbers on a spreadsheet. He arrived at the plant in a tailored Italian suit, carrying a tablet, and immediately began talking about operational synergy, asset utilization, and slashing redundant overhead. In his first week, Brad held a town hall meeting in the main cafeteria. He stood in front of men who had worked at the forge for 30 years, pointing to a slide deck that showed our production costs compared to non-union shops in the Deep South. He announced that we needed to increase throughput by 25% while cutting maintenance budgets by 15%. I sat in the back of the room, my arms crossed, watching the faces of the senior machinists. They knew, just as I did, that you cannot run a high-volume hot forging line past its design limits without something breaking. Heavy machinery requires respect, and more importantly, it requires maintenance. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my small office in the control room, opened my engineering log, and began preparing for the storm that I knew was coming. Brad was chasing a $250,000 performance bonus that was tied to the plant's quarterly EBITDA. He didn't care about the long-term health of the machines, and he certainly didn't care about the safety of the men operating them. My weekly routine had always been simple. Every Friday afternoon before I went home, I would log into the licensing server, verify the handshake log, and manually sign off on the weekly operational token. It was a 5-minute task, a quiet reminder of the contract we signed in 2006. For 18 years, Roger had paid the annual maintenance fee without question, appreciating the safety net my presence provided. But as I looked at the new organizational chart Brad had drawn up, I noticed my name was highlighted in red. To a young MBA, a 52-year-old engineer making a comfortable salary was just an expensive line item waiting to be optimized. I closed my laptop, packed my briefcase, and walked out to the parking lot. The air was crisp, and the smell of sulfur and heated steel hung heavy in the air. I looked back at the massive steel siding of the plant, realizing that the foundation of this entire multi-million-dollar operation was resting on a digital handshake that only I controlled. The conflict began on a humid Tuesday morning in early October. I was sitting at my workbench, diagnostic software open on my screen, monitoring the thermal cycles of the main melting furnace. The HMI panels on the plant floor were reporting a minor fault on press 3. The hydraulic pressure relief valve was triggering intermittent warning flags. It wasn't a critical failure yet, but it indicated that the main hydraulic seal was degrading. Over the last 3 months, Brad had pushed the press line past its standard operating pressure to force a 20% increase in cycle speed. Under normal procedures, we needed to shut down, press 3 for 12 hours, vent the high-pressure accumulators, and replace the polyurethane seal. It was a standard $500 maintenance job, but it required downtime, and downtime was Brad's greatest enemy. The door to my office slammed open, and Brad walked in, followed by the plant foreman, Marcus, who looked incredibly uncomfortable. Brad didn't bother with greetings. He tossed a printed spreadsheet onto my desk, pointing a finger at the red numbers. We are tracking 600 units behind our weekly target for the heavy equipment contract, Brad said, his voice sharp and tense. I just looked at the log. Press 3 shut down 3 times yesterday because of that safety warning. Marcus tells me it's a software flag. It is, I replied, keeping my voice level. The PLC is detecting a pressure drop across the secondary seal. When the pressure falls below the threshold, the safety loop triggers an automatic stop. It prevents the hydraulic oil, which is under 3,000 pounds per square inch of pressure, from atomizing and spraying onto the hot steel billets. If that happens, we have a catastrophic fire. We don't have time for a fire drill, Leonard, Brad snapped. And we don't have 12 hours to sit around waiting for a mechanic to change a piece of rubber. I need you to go into the Siemens programming block, find the logic gate for the press 3 pressure safety threshold, and bypass it. Increase the allowable pressure variance so the line doesn't shut down. We just need to get through the end of the month. I looked at Brad. He was standing there, adjusting the cuffs of his light blue dress shirt, completely oblivious to the physical reality of the machine floor. I can't do that, Brad, I said quietly. Brad's eyes narrowed. What do you mean you can't? You wrote the code. You have the administrative access. Writing the code means I understand the engineering principles behind it, I explained. The safety interlocks are there for a reason. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration regulations, specifically Section 1910.217, require mechanical power presses to have operational fail-safe mechanisms. If I bypass the pressure sensor, we lose the fail-safe. If that seal fails completely while a hot billet is in the die, the high-pressure hydraulic fluid will vaporize instantly. The temperature of that steel is 2200 degrees. You won't just have a broken press, Brad. You will have a fireball that will incinerate the operator standing at the control station. You engineers always blow things out of proportion, Brad scoffed, stepping closer to my desk. The machines have safety factors built in. They can handle a little extra stress. I am the chief operating officer of this company, and I am making the operational call. I am instructing you to bypass the safety interlocks on press 3 immediately. And I am telling you, as the lead automation engineer, that I refuse, I said, standing up to meet his gaze. I will not put my signature on a software modification that bypasses a critical safety system. If you want to replace the seal, I can have the maintenance team ready by 6 o'clock tonight. We can have the line back up for the morning shift. 6 o'clock tonight means losing 6 hours of prime production, Brad yelled, his face turning red. That is unacceptable. You are costing this company $75,000 in lost volume. I don't pay you to make executive decisions, Leonard. I pay you to keep the line moving. You have been sitting in this comfortable office for 18 years, thinking you are irreplaceable. But your old friend Roger isn't running the show anymore. Roger understood that dead workers don't make steel parts, I said, my voice remaining ice cold. Don't you lecture me about safety, Brad shouted, his voice echoing out of my office and onto the plant floor. Several machinists paused their work, looking up at our glass-walled office. You are being insubordinate. You are actively sabotaging our production targets because you want to prove a point. If you won't modify the code, I will find an automation contractor who will. You're done, Leonard. I stared at him for a 3-second silence. Are you firing me, Brad? Yes, I am firing you, Brad screamed, throwing his hands in the air. For insubordination and willful neglect of duty, I want you out of this building immediately. Marcus, go get the security guard. Leonard, pack your personal laptop and your tools. You have 10 minutes to clear out your desk. Marcus looked horrified. Brad, wait. Leonard is the only one who knows the PLC logic. If we have a system error. I don't care, Brad cut him off. We can hire a consulting firm from Chicago to manage the PLCs. No one is indispensable. Get security up here now. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I didn't throw a fit. I simply looked at Brad, saw the arrogant smirk on his face, and said, Understood. I sat back down, opened my engineering console, and performed a clean log-off from the primary automation server. I closed my Siemens TI portal software. I took my personal notebook, my engineering log, and my personal toolkit containing my specialized multimeter and alignment keys. I placed them neatly into my briefcase. Brad stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching me like a warden. A security guard arrived, looking embarrassed, as he had known me for 15 years. I'm sorry, Leonard, the guard whispered. It's all right, Carl, I said, using his name. I signed the standard company exit log at the front desk. Brad had already instructed human resources to process my termination without severance, citing my refusal to bypass the safety sensor as cause. I didn't argue. I knew the law and I knew what was about to happen. I walked out of the heavy glass doors of the administrative building, the cool autumn air hitting my face. I got into my truck, started the engine, and drove home. I didn't look back in anger. I looked forward to Monday morning. When I got home, the first thing I did was make a pot of strong chicory coffee. I walked down the hall to my home office, a quiet room lined with technical manuals and old electronics projects. I sat at my oak desk and opened the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, pulling out a faded manila folder labeled Coleman Metal Works, 2006 contract. I spread the yellowing pages across the desk. There it was, in clear, black and white print. The software development and licensing agreement between Coleman Metal Works, Inc. and Vance Automation Systems, LLC. I flipped to Section 4, titled Intellectual Property, Licensing, and Verification. The legal language was precise. It stated that all proprietary software libraries, custom PLC control blocks, and mathematical thermal models developed by Vance Automation Systems, LLC remained the sole property of the developer. Coleman Metal Works was granted a non-transferable, revocable license to run the software. Crucially, Section 4.2 outlined the terms of revocation. The licensor reserves the right to suspend or terminate software operation in the event of contract termination, non-payment of the annual licensing maintenance fee, or material breach of plant safety standards, upon which the software license shall be deemed expired. In his haste to cut costs, Brad hadn't even checked the accounting files. The annual $5,000 licensing fee for 2026 was already 3 months overdue. Roger had always paid it late, and I had never pressed him because we had a gentleman's agreement. But with my termination, the contract was officially void. Under the terms of the agreement, I had no obligation to maintain the software. I opened my personal laptop and booted up my development environment. I established a secure connection to my private virtual server, which hosted the licensing verification handshake. The architecture was elegant in its simplicity. Inside the Siemens S7-1500 PLC at the plant, there was a custom function block I called FB Resense Guard. Every Friday at 4 o'clock, this block initiated an encrypted Modbus TCP handshake request to the local server in the plant manager's office. The local server, in turn, routed the request through a secure VPN tunnel to my cloud server, verifying that the license key was still valid and that Vance Automation Systems, LLC had approved the next 7 days of operation. If the handshake succeeded, the local server generated a one-time cryptographic token that kept the PLC's running state in active mode. If the handshake failed, the PLC would trigger a validation warning HMI alarm. If the warning was ignored and the handshake failed for 2 consecutive weeks, the PLC would initiate a controlled, safe ramp-down of the induction furnaces and the hydraulic pumps at the next scheduled shift change. It wouldn't damage the machines. It would simply refuse to engage the main hydraulic relays, locking the plant out of production mode. The next handshake was scheduled for Friday at 4 p.m. I logged into my cloud server management console. I located the licensing daemon for Coleman Metal Works. With 3 clicks, I disabled the automatic token generation script. The status changed from active to pending revocation. Next, I opened a blank document and drafted a formal certified letter to the Board of Directors of Coleman Metal Works, with a copy sent directly to Roger Coleman's personal email address. I attached the 2006 contract, the unpaid invoice for the annual maintenance fee, and my formal notification that the software license was revoked effective immediately, due to contract termination and material breach of safety standards. But I wasn't done yet. I opened the official website of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration and navigated to the whistleblower complaint portal. I spent the next 4 hours compiling a detailed report. I uploaded exported logs from the Siemens PLC system that showed the intermittent pressure drops on press 3. I attached a copy of the plant's internal maintenance log showing that Brad had canceled the scheduled repair window for the hydraulic seal. Finally, I wrote a detailed narrative of the confrontation in my office, including the names of the witnesses on the plant floor. I submitted the complaint under 29 U.S.C. CC 660C, which protects employees from retaliatory firing after refusing to perform hazardous illegal work. By the time I finished, it was past 7 in the evening. I shut down my laptop and walked out to the kitchen to prepare dinner. For 18 years, my mind had been constantly tied to that factory. I had spent countless nights waking up at 2 in the morning to drive to the plant because a sensor had failed or a line had jammed. Now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, I had nothing to do. On Friday afternoon at exactly 4 or 5 p.m., I sat in my study and watched the server logs. A connection request appeared on my dashboard. It was the plant's IP address, trying to reach my licensing server. The daemon received the request, processed the license key, and returned a 403 forbidden status. 5 minutes later, another request came in. Then another. The PLC was retrying the handshake. The local server in the office logged the failure. On the plant floor, the HMI screens would now be displaying a yellow warning banner at the bottom of the screen. Software license renewal required. 72 hours remaining. I knew what would happen. The operators would see the warning, but they wouldn't understand what it meant. They would assume it was a minor IT glitch. Brad, if he even noticed it, would dismiss it as an administrative detail. He was too busy celebrating the extra 300 steering knuckles they had stamped out on press 3 by running it through the safety warnings. I closed my browser, shut my laptop, and decided to spend the weekend fishing at the lake. I turned off my phone, let the gears turn. The clock was ticking, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Monday morning arrived with a clear sky and a crisp wind. I woke up at my usual time, but instead of putting on my steel-toed boots and grease-stained work shirt, I wore a comfortable flannel shirt and jeans. I sat on my porch with my tablet, checking the weather. At 9:15 a.m., my personal phone began to vibrate. The screen showed the caller ID, Coleman Metal Works main office. I set the phone face down on the table and took a slow sip of coffee. 30 seconds later, it stopped. Then it rang again and again. By 9:30 a.m., I had 6 missed calls from Brad Coleman, 3 from the plant foreman Marcus, and 2 text messages. One of Marcus's texts read, "Leonard, please pick up. The entire automated line just went down. Everything is frozen. HMI says license validation timeout. Brad is losing his mind." I didn't reply. I knew exactly what was happening at the plant. At 9 a.m., the 72-hour grace period had expired. The FB licenses guard function block inside the Siemens PLC had executed its safe ramp-down command. The conveyor belts had stopped, the induction coils had cooled, and the 4,000-ton hydraulic presses had locked their rams in the safety position. In the plant manager's office, Brad was likely screaming at the IT staff, demanding they bypass the server block. But the IT department had no control over the plant's industrial control network. The PLC was physical hardware running compiled machine code. At 10 a.m., a different number appeared on my screen. It was Roger Coleman's personal cell phone. I slid the bar to answer. "Leonard." Roger's voice sounded tired, raspy, and older than usual. "I just read the certified letter you sent to the board, and I've got my nephew in my office shaking like a leaf. The plant is dead, Leonard. We're losing $85,000 an hour in production value. Our primary client, Caterpillar, has an ironclad delivery clause. If we miss our daily shipment of steering knuckles, they will charge us a contract penalty of $1.2 million per day to cover their assembly line downtime." "What is going on?" "Hello, Roger," I said, keeping my voice gentle out of respect for the old man. "I'm sorry you had to be dragged into this, but your nephew fired me last Tuesday. He fired me because I refused to bypass the pressure safety sensors on press 3, which has a failing hydraulic seal. He claimed it was insubordination." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Roger taking a deep, ragged breath. "He did what?" Roger whispered. "He wanted me to modify the PLC safety logic to keep the line running despite a critical OSHA hazard," I explained. "I refused. He fired me without severance and told me I was easily replaced. I complied with his order to leave. However, as you know from our 2006 contract, the custom PLC software is licensed to Coleman Metal Works through my firm, Vance Automation Systems LLC. That license requires an active agreement and the annual maintenance fee, which is 3 months overdue. Since Brad terminated my contract and refused to pay the fees, the license has expired. The system performed a standard, safe shutdown." "Leonard, we've known each other for 20 years, Roger said, his voice pleading. "Can't you just log in and bypass it for now? We can sort out the paperwork later." "I can't do that, Roger," I replied. "Brad made it clear that I am no longer an employee. More importantly, I will not reactivate a system that is running under unsafe conditions." I filed an official whistleblower report with OSHA on Wednesday. They will likely have an inspector at the plant by tomorrow morning. Roger groaned. I understand. I'm calling a special board meeting at 1 o'clock this afternoon. I want you there, Leonard. I won't attend a board meeting as an employee, Roger, I said. But my attorney, Oliver Stone, has his office on 4th Street. If you and Brad want to negotiate a new agreement, you can meet us there at 3 o'clock. We'll be there, Roger said and hung up. Meanwhile, back at the plant, Brad had tried to bypass me. He had contacted a large industrial engineering consulting based in Chicago. They had sent 2 automation engineers to the plant with their specialized programming laptops. Marcus told me later what happened. The consultants had plugged into the plant's network switch and opened the Siemens project. But when they tried to open the main program blocks, they were met with a password prompt. The code was compiled with know-how protection, a Siemens security feature that encrypts the block logic on the PLC's memory card. The consultant spent 3 hours trying to crack the encryption. Finally, the lead engineer closed his laptop and turned to Brad. We can't bypass this, the consultant said. This code is highly customized and fully encrypted. Even if we wiped the PLCs and tried to rewrite the program from scratch, it would take a team of 3 engineers at least 3 months to trace all the physical inputs, program the thermal predictive curves, and rebuild the safety loops. And that's assuming we don't destroy your machinery during testing. You need the man who wrote this. At 2:55 p.m., I walked into Oliver Stone's law office. Oliver was a sharp, 55-year-old attorney who specialized in corporate contract law and intellectual property. He was sitting at the conference table, reviewing the documents we had prepared. Exactly at 3 o'clock, the door opened. Roger Coleman walked in, looking frail but determined. Behind him came Brad, his expensive suit now rumpled, his hair messy, and his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and anger. He looked like a man who had just realized his entire career was hanging by a thread. Let's sit down, Oliver said, gesturing to the leather chairs. Brad immediately glared at me. This is extortion. You locked our systems. That is corporate sabotage. We can sue you for millions. Oliver didn't blink. He calmly slid a document across the table. Mr. Coleman, I suggest you read the Software Development and Licensing Agreement of 2006, which your uncle signed. Section 4 clearly states that the software is a licensed asset, not a sold commodity. Your company breached the agreement by failing to pay the licensing fee, and you subsequently terminated the contract with my client. The software automatically deactivated itself per the built-in contract terms. There was no hacking, no sabotage, and no unauthorized access. Your company simply lost the right to use our proprietary technology. If you attempt to sue, we will counter-sue for copyright infringement under Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, and we will seek immediate injunctive relief to prevent you from using any portion of that code. Brad looked at his uncle, but Roger wasn't looking at him. Roger was staring at the table, his face grim. What are your terms, Leonard? Roger asked quietly. This is 1083 words. Perfect. Let's write the file. Oliver Stone adjusted his glasses and slid a fresh document across the table. It was a single-page term sheet printed on clean bond paper. Here are our terms for the restoration of the software license and engineering consulting services, Oliver announced, his voice smooth and professional. Brad snatched the paper and read it. As his eyes scanned the bullet points, his face went from pale to a dark, mottled purple. $50,000 a year for the license? $120,000 upfront retainer? $350 an hour for consulting? This is highway robbery. You were making $140,000 a year as an employee. I was, I said calmly. But I am no longer an employee. You terminated my employment, Brad. You chose to void that arrangement. If you want to use my intellectual property now, you will pay the market rate for a specialized systems architect. Advanced Automation Systems LLC does not work on a discount. We will not pay this, Brad yelled, slamming his hand on the table. Uncle Roger, tell them no. We can find someone else. We can sue them. Roger Coleman didn't look at his nephew. He took a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket, put them on, and read the term sheet slowly. He nodded his head, then took off the glasses and looked at Brad. Brad, shut up, Roger said. The tone was quiet, but it had the weight of 30 years of authority. Brad froze, his mouth half open. "If we don't start the line by tonight," Roger said, looking at his nephew, "Caterpillar will cancel our primary contract. They will charge us $1.2 million for today's downtime. By tomorrow morning, that will be $2.4 million. In 3 days, our bank will call in our operating line of credit. Coleman Metal Works will be bankrupt by Friday. Do you have a plan to write a Siemens automation program in the next 12 hours? Brad swallowed hard, his arrogance evaporating into thin air. "No, sir," he mumbled. "Then you have cost this company over $1 million in a single day because of your sheer incompetence and greed," Roger said, his voice cold. He turned to Oliver. "There is one term missing from this sheet, Mr. Stone. My nephew's name is still on the executive directory." "Actually, Roger," I spoke up, "that is the final condition. I will not provide consulting services to any company where Brad Coleman has operational authority. He represents a severe liability to plant safety and a direct threat to the workers. For me to sign this agreement, Brad must be removed from his position as Chief Operating Officer immediately, with a written clause stating he will have no involvement in the company's management going forward." "You can't do that," Brad gasped, looking panicked. "Uncle Roger, I'm family. You can't let this worker dictate who runs the company." Roger looked at Brad with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "Leonard isn't dictating it, Brad. I am. You violated the safety principles that built this company. You put my workers' lives at risk to chase a spreadsheet number, and you almost destroyed a 40-year-old business in the process. You are fired, Brad. Pack your things from the executive suite this afternoon. Your father and I will discuss your trust fund adjustments later." Brad stood there, stunned, his face completely drained of color. He looked at me, then at Roger, realizing there was no escape. Without another word, he turned, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out of the conference room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was peaceful. Roger turned to me, a small, tired smile on his face. "I should have never let him take the wheel, Leonard. I'm sorry." "I know, Roger," I said. "Let's get your plant back online." Roger signed the contract on behalf of Coleman Metal Works. Within 10 minutes, their accounting department initiated a wire transfer of $170,000 to the bank account of Vance Automation Systems LLC, covering the $50,000 annual licensing fee, the $5,000 past due maintenance fees, and the $120,000 consulting retainer. My phone buzzed with a bank notification. The funds were cleared. I opened my laptop, connected to my cloud server, and reactivated the automated token generator for the Coleman Metal Works local server. Within 90 seconds, the handshake was completed. At the plant, the red warning screen on the HMI panel cleared, replaced by the familiar green operating dashboard. The hydraulic pump relays clicked open and the cooling fans began to hum. Under the terms of the consulting agreement, I rode back to the plant that evening. I supervised the maintenance crew as they vented the hydraulic accumulators on press 3 and replaced the failing seal. It took 6 hours of clean, methodical work. There were no shortcuts and no safety sensors were bypassed. By midnight, the press was running smoothly at its standard safe operating pressure. The next morning, the OSHA inspector arrived at the plant. Because of my detailed report, they conducted a thorough audit of the forging line. They found the hydraulic seal newly replaced, the safety light curtains fully operational, and the system operating in full compliance with safety standards. They issued a minor administrative citation for the past pressure drops, resulting in a small $5,000 fine which Roger paid without complaint. Brad Coleman moved back to Chicago. The last I heard, he was working as an entry-level data analyst for a logistics firm, far away from any heavy machinery. As for me, I transitioned fully into my consulting career. I only work 40 hours a month now, mostly doing code audits and safety validations for various manufacturing plants in the state. I spend my mornings on my porch, enjoying the quiet, and my weekends on the lake. Sometimes when I drive past the industrial park, I see the steam rising from the cooling towers of Coleman Metal Works. I smile, knowing that the massive machines are still roaring, the steel is still being forged, and the men on the floor are safe. All because of a few lines of code and a digital handshake that stood its ground.